And in addition to being a forerunner and a front runner of queer clergy long before it became a thing that now I most only know queer clergy at this point. I don't even think I know any straight clergy at this point, which is pretty good. It's pretty good. Yeah, it's pretty good. But it's also just a wise woman, a wise grandmother, who I also can't believe that. That always seems striking to me as well. And when I started thinking about who were the kind of people I wanted to have to talk about the nature of peace in 2019, Tara was one of the very first people that came to mind. So because I am hoarse, I'm not going to talk too long, but I love you. Jenna, I love you as well. I think we'll be hearing more from Jenna before the night is over, but I'm going to hand it over to you, and welcome to Peace House. Warm round of applause for Reverend Tara Wilkins.
Y'all will probably be able to hear me okay. Generally, projection is not a problem I have. Well, thanks for coming out tonight on a beautiful Friday night. I always feel like in Portland we're competing with the weather when we get together.
Yeah.
So let's take a holy deep breath in as we're all sitting here together and notice the people around you. The format for tonight is I'm going to talk for a little bit, and then I'm going to ask a couple questions for you to share with your neighbors, and we'll do that for several segments, and then at the end we can have a big old conversation. How about that? The first time I saw myself on television, it said Reverend Tara Wilkins, Christian activist. And I had never seen that word activist attached to my name before. And I couldn't tell in that moment whether that was a good idea or not. Mm-hmm. And I had to wrestle with, am I an activist that happens to be a pastor? Or am I a pastor who happens to be an activist? Mm-hmm. Because in the circles that I was in, it was real easy for them to see, shall we say, my presentation as the big dyke activist and not take me seriously for my spiritual wisdom or expression or how I move through the world. And so it took me a while to kind of figure out what identity I could claim authentically, and I claim both, but I am pastor first and activist second, because all being an activist is articulating your faith in the world, which is part of the Christian call. So I thought I'd start out a little bit by talking about faith formation. We don't get involved in this work just because, generally. And I didn't get involved in this work just for political reasons, though if you know me, you might be surprised by that. My first experiences of God were when I was a child in my grandmother's house, where she had this maple tree in the backyard. Maybe some of you had a tree in your childhood. And I would go, and I remember when I was old enough to finally climb up into the limbs where I could sit, and just the peace that I experienced there were my first experiences of really experiencing God. Now, my parents were both Episcopalian, they were divorced, and church was sort of, I always knew it was something important to them, but they didn't exactly model it. So I didn't have lengthy Bible discussions or even experiences really much at Christmas and Easter. Once in a while we would go, and they'd make me wear a dress, and I had to have those white shoes with the little, the little purse that matches, and it was awful. It was kind of torturous, actually. But then as a young adult, after I had a couple of children, I had this sense that they needed some kind of spiritual formation. And I had been baptized in the Presbyterian church, so I took them to the Presbyterian church. And I loved the sense of the sacred and the formality of the worship and the way that you could just feel something else there. I didn't have I wasn't sure exactly how to reconcile my theology with some of my earlier experiences, but I just had this sense of the holy. Because when I was 8, 9, or 10, there was a green school bus that used to come around the neighborhood. Now, I grew up with a single mom who was a waitress and who worked on Saturday nights, so getting up on Sunday morning was not her thing. And if there was a school bus that was going to come and collect the children in the neighborhood and entertain me for a few hours, she was all for that. So I went to this hail, fire, and brimstone kind of church. You know, the kind where the pastor pounds the pulpit and gets red and you can see the veins in his neck. But at that church, they taught me something really important. They taught me to pray. Now, I don't pray for the ticket to heaven that church taught about. I don't have that theology of heaven and hell anymore. But what I learned in that experience was that God was accessible to me in the moment. That I didn't need a church or a minister to intercess for me. That I had direct access. And that fact carried me through a very tumultuous adolescence and into my early experiences in the church. So as I got more active in the church, again, I didn't have a really well-formed theology, or I wasn't super articulate about God, but I knew that there was something else there. So I got super involved. I went to every Presbyterian Women's gathering there was. They paid for me to go everywhere. They'd say, you go and come tell us about it, because they were so excited to have this young woman in her 20s go, and they were tired, and they enjoyed my enthusiasm, and I soaked it all in. And what I learned in those experiences was that was the first time I ever went and learned about, it was back when Ben Weir first got released after being held captive. Do you remember that? Or some of you remember that era? He had been held hostage in Lebanon along with like 80 other people. And he was back. He's a Presbyterian minister. And so he was at this gathering. And I learned to look at the world through the eyes of my faith. So my faith became an integral part. I looked at politics through the eyes of my faith for the very first time. And I learned that in those women's circles, in those knitting circles, and in all the events that they sent to me. So I became more integrated at that point. My faith became more integrated. But then there was a problem, because I figured out I was a lesbian. And I figured out I had a call to ministry. And that was the same year that I was having my fourth child, when I was 24. Right? It's a lot. It was a big year. And suddenly, all the rules in this very welcoming experience I had in the church, and them sending me places and loving on me, the rules changed. And suddenly they weren't sure I was welcome. And there was this language about an unrepentant, self-avowed, practicing homosexual. I guess that's what I was, because I certainly was unrepentant. And I was definitely self-avowed. I wasn't sure how much practice I needed, but I was clearly same-gender loving. And that experience of being ostracized by the church and then rejected by this faith that had welcomed me all along was one of the most painful experiences of my life. Because it didn't make sense to me. If we're teaching that God loves everyone, and then we act in a way that shows that except for, I didn't understand that. And I started to get involved in the welcoming faith movement. Now, lots of people don't know there is a welcoming faith movement, but there is a welcoming faith movement. And the welcoming faith movement started in the 70s. You know, social justice movements go in cycles of 20 to 40 years. And if you remember, on the heels of the civil rights movement in the early 70s, we had all the rights movements that were emerging, right? Women's rights, pet rights, animal rights. And the church got really scared. The Protestant church got really scared in those years. And most of the mainline Protestant denominations adopted policies against the ordination of gay and lesbian people. That we didn't talk about bisexual. We still don't talk much about bisexuals, but and we definitely weren't talking about trans folk back then. And so in the wake of that, most of the mainline denominations developed a group that was responsible for educating the church and working for justice within the church. The More Light Presbyterians and Reconciling United Methodists, and each denomination has a different name for the same sort of open and affirming group. And some momentum started to be built, but then we hit the early 80s. And two things happened in the early 80s. Do you know what they were? AIDS. Right? And what was the other one? Reagan. And suddenly, the gay rights movement stalled because we had an epidemic to deal with that the Reagan administration refused to deal with. And many of you were involved, I'm sure, in those early days of caring for people with HIV and AIDS. And that slowed things down a lot. And it wasn't until the 90s that we began to understand how to have a conversation around values. So the language moved from rights into values, and we started talking about family values. But our definition, a more liberal, progressive definition of family values. Now remember, I said that those of you who know me well might think that I got involved for political reasons, but I actually got involved because people were lying about God. It was offensive to me, and I felt a sacred responsibility that somebody's got to say that that's not true, because God doesn't hate. And God doesn't hate God's rainbow tribe. And so I felt an urgency to get out and to be involved. And so for over 30 years, I've been working within this welcoming faith movement to try to counterbalance that dominant religious voice. And that dominant, really, you might have heard Franklin Graham just recently. That is still the dominant religious voice in our culture. So there are those things that we get involved in because we have some kind of passion or connection to the issue. So for me, it became the LGBT movement, but also part of that was the freedom to marry. So when I moved to Oregon around 2000, I started working with an organization called the Community of Welcoming Congregations. I just stepped down earlier this year after 16 years. Through that, I developed different lenses of understanding. So when we first started working in Oregon around issues of marriage, it sort of happened quickly. I started working with the organization, and 8 months later, Basic Rights Oregon gave me a call and said, tomorrow, Multnomah County is going to start issuing marriage license. Can you get some clergy there? And a few weeks prior to that, San Francisco had started issuing marriage license. You might remember that. So I was already thinking about it, knowing that we were going to have to take a stand as an organization, and also recognizing that most of our member denominations had a stand against marriage. And so when she said to me, can you get some clergy there? I wasn't sure. I mean, there's the usual suspects, right? The Unitarian Universalists, the United Church of Christ, and the Jewish community. But I wasn't sure that people were ready for that. And so I did some calling around, and it was sort of a magical time in those few days at the Keller Auditorium, where we had cocktail tables lined up. You'd have a rabbi and a Unitarian minister and a Christian pastor marrying couples, and it was this swell of love. Now, prior to that, if you had asked me, was the freedom to marry the most important issue in the LGBT community, I would have said no. Because I would have been much more concerned about hate crimes and violence against the queer community. I was more concerned about non-discrimination, how it's still legal in 28 states to be fired for being gay. But that time, those 7 weeks that we could marry couples, about 3,300 couples came from all over the country to be married here. I married about 100 of them. It changed me forever, because I watched what it did for them when I said, now by the power vested in me by the state of Oregon, I declare you legally married. I watched how it lifted years of oppression and family rejection and church rejection in those holy and sacred moments. And it changed me. And it's also when I realized that there were multiple layers of issues that needed working on. We had a hard time getting clergy to sign on. I traveled all over the state. We couldn't get faith communities to come to Pride. So there was a time where I went to every Pride in the state, and I would set up a CWC table, and I would invite all the local faith communities to come. And sometimes, even if they were already open and affirming, they were reluctant to come to Pride festivals. They were reluctant to be engaged politically. So we had to do this whole layer of education with religious people about how advocating for the LGBT community is an act of faith, and help them to see that as part of their responsibility as faith leaders and members of a faith community. And now it isn't even necessary for me to go to all the prides, because in the local communities, the local faith communities now come and table and engage. And when the Supreme Court case happened and we finally had the right to marry, and Basic Rights Oregon set up this wedding chapel thing, we had more clergy there than we had couples. Because by then everybody wanted to be part of it. But it was not always that way. The other really important thing that I learned in that time was those first 3 days, I felt strongly that we had to have a press conference, a proactive press conference, where the faith leaders said that as a matter of faith, we stand with these couples who are getting married. Because I didn't want our message to be in response to the negative religious message, which I knew was coming. And so I had to push hard with the campaign people and the political activists who were planning our strategy to make that happen. And we got about 50 faith leaders to stand there with every news camera I'd ever seen. And, they don't teach you media training in seminary, by the way. So everything I've learned about dealing with the media, I've learned the hard way, in real time, usually in front of a camera. And every media outlet from all around was there. I'd never seen anything like it. And I wrote the press release, and there was this big theological debate before we decided who was going to read what, because the rabbi, I don't know if you remember Rabbi Rose. Uh-huh. He was a force. He's retired now. But I had said something in there about Christian theology, sort of about saying there's nothing in our sacred text that prohibits this or something like that. And he's like, well, we reject that. And, the Christians all gasp, right? Because we actually would rather do exegetical calisthenics around those texts, whereas the Jewish community was much clearer to say, hey, we just reject that. And I decided to leave that out of the press release rather than have an argument with him right before we were due to speak. But when we got up there, and we had arranged it so each of us, like there were 4 of us, each of us said a few lines, I looked around the room, and every queer person that was standing around the room was crying. And I wasn't prepared for that. I didn't realize that for them, this was a healing moment. That many of them had been kicked out of their families, had been rejected, had been told they were an abomination. And in that moment, to see all these cranky older clergy people in robes and vests saying we love you and we believe in you and we think this is right, was a healing moment. And that's when I realized we have to have more than one lens to do this work. We have to pay attention to each of us have a different vantage point for why this is important and what impact it can make and what difference it makes. And so our work started to be geared towards both and, as we learned different perspectives and understood that there was sort of our religious and spiritual obligation to facilitate healing, and then there was also our political obligation to plow forward and to make a difference. Because sometimes we feel like in the liberal faith movement that we don't outnumber the evangelicals, so what power do we have? Well, in the 2005 legislative session, there was a bill called Senate Bill 1000 that had both civil unions and non-discrimination in the same piece of legislation. And that bill passed in the Senate. And then when it went to the House for vote, the then Speaker of the House, Karen Minnis, does that name ring a bell for those of you who've been around? She assigned that bill to the Finance Committee. Well, that's weird. Isn't that weird? Why would you do that? Well, the reason that she did that was that the Finance Committee is the only committee, I don't know if this is still true, but it was back in 2005, it was the only committee in the House that a bill couldn't be called to the floor by a representative. They could only be pushed out to the floor by the chair of the committee, who was a Republican and was against the legislation. So it died. But we did really, really important work there. And so in 2007, we came back with 2 bills, with civil unions, which was changed into domestic partnerships, and the non-discrimination bill. And when I couldn't understand this because the conservative religious folks put all their energy into the non-discrimination bill. And I figured they'd be against marriage, right? That's sort of the logical thing, right? Until I learned about why that was. With our non-discrimination law in Oregon, if you are a church or a faith community, you don't have to hire the gay organist, not that anybody ever does that. You can choose on whatever criteria you want for your house of worship. But if you have a for-profit bookstore or a for-profit coffee shop, those businesses have to abide by non-discrimination laws. And that's what they didn't want to do. So they put a lot of energy into that. And so we filled the gallery in Salem with faith leaders. And I had collected letters from around the state, from all different denominations and traditions. And so Dennis Richardson, may you rest in peace, got up and he said, on the floor of the house, he said, "People of faith will never stand for this." And Lori Moynes Anderson, I don't know if you know that name, she picked up our packet and she looked through these letters and she said, "Well, which people of faith?" Because the Shul in Eugene and the Episcopal Church in Ashland and the UCC in the Dalles, they're all telling us to pass this. Which people of faith? And what that did was it gave them the inability to play the God card.
Yeah.
Where politically they could say God is on their side. We could say, rightly so, there's a variety of religious views. So religion can't be the reason that we make this civil decision. Mm-hmm. And that empowered all kinds of action as, the most unchurched state in the country, arguably. It gave us more sort of political energy to speak out and to make a difference. And it began to change things. And people began to use their faith voice. Because, the hard thing about being religious in Portland is it's not cool. And it's almost anti-religious. And I kind of have always resented that. Because I feel like I'm just a dyke trying to make a difference here. Like we're the cool church. We have to remember that sometimes we're not always as inclusive as we think we are. And my big learning came with a student that I often guest lecture around universities around the state. And I was at PSU. And there was this student who was taking a class in cross-cultural communication. And he had an assignment where he had to meet with someone from a different cultural experience other than his own. And for 4 one-hour interviews. It's a long time. But you got to decide that based on however you defined it. So he called his pastor because he wanted to meet somebody from the LGBT community. And his pastor referred him to me. And I met with him. And in the first session, I realized right away that he had only grown up with one idea of what it meant to be Christian. And that he was a Republican and a veteran and had really conservative ideas about God. And I shared with him that I have the world's best grandchildren. We're getting ready this year to have number 10. And I shared why marriage matters, and I shared the importance that in Christian theology of why and how we are all welcome at the same table, that we don't get to decide that, right? So in the second meeting, he said to me, well, Pastor, I was thinking about what you said and he said, if you believe that Jesus died for our sins and we're all saved by grace, then of course you're welcome at my table. And I said to him, what if I don't believe that Jesus died for our sins in the same way you do? Am I so welcome at your table? And he didn't know. So we sat with the awkwardness of that not knowing. And the funny thing is that I realized that I was having a harder time than he was. And that if I had known who he was, I may not have agreed to meet with him for so long. Because I had established barriers to protect myself. And my other big learning in that moment was that it doesn't matter whether he and I acknowledge that we have a right to be at the same table because it's not our table. And I realized that I have not mastered talking to fundamentalist Christians in this way, but he taught me why I should. Because the reality is that we follow the same Jesus. That we both have been transformed by the living God. And that it doesn't matter whether we can acknowledge that link or not, that link exists. And it made me think, maybe as progressive Christians, maybe our job is to build the bridge. Because relationship always matters. And that we allow ourselves to be in this polarized way over religious reasons or political reasons. And I told him he was struggling so much with the idea of white male privilege. He had never heard anything like that. So he's having this culture shock, right? And he said, Portland prides itself on being inclusive. He said, unless you're a Republican or a conservative Christian. And I realized he had pain around that. So I was trying to be his pastor in those moments. And I said to him, the public discourse is almost always political. And we need to remember that we're not red people or blue people. We are God's people. Because liberals, we do the same things that we say, that we accuse the conservatives of doing. We put people in those boxes based on how they register to vote. And I learned more from him in those sessions. It changed my message to the liberal congregations about maybe what our role is and how we can still stand where we stand on our issues of inclusion, of immigration reform, of working for the poor, but not demonize the other. Because demonizing the other is not going to help us get to be where we need to be. And I learned that from him. I'm grateful to him for that. And I don't know when it came time to vote, if it would have come to a vote, if he would have voted for the freedom to marry. But I learned from him in those moments why we need to build relationships in a different kind of way, even with groups that historically have done harm to us. And I started to realize that as we're looking at these issues, we have to have an understanding of how people in different social locations are viewing them. That was kind of new for me. It was kind of a cutting edge sort of thing. And then again, I grew up in South Jersey, and I paid attention when Michael Brown died, and I paid attention when Trayvon Martin died, and I felt things. But it wasn't until Eric Gardner died that everything changed for me. There was something about the I can't breathe being ignored, that something clicked in me. And you may remember years ago when President Obama was first running for president, he belonged to Trinity United Church of Christ in Chicago. And Jeremiah Wright was the pastor there. And so when they started that awful political process of digging into every shadow in your past and everything, they took Jeremiah Wright's, some of his sermons out of context. And they painted him as the angry black man without ever asking, why? Why is he angry? What is making him feel those things? We never asked that. And I noticed that when those topics were up in the media. So when the Baltimore riots happened, I asked why. Because most people don't go around destroying things just 'cause, right? Mm-hmm. What is it that they feel so desperate and so unheard that this is necessary? And I'm embarrassed to admit that I did not know that redlining still happens. I did not know that redlining is still enculturated in the federal housing code. I didn't know that. And that sent me down a path where I started to learn about a woman named Robin DeAngelis. Maybe some of you who've done racial justice work know her name. And she did this segment in the UCC white privilege curriculum that it took me a year to recover from. And I'm not exaggerating. Because she painted the idea of the fact that there is an intentional white system. I did not know that. as aware as I felt that I was, as politically active as I've been my whole adult life, I did not know. And she talked about our education system that teaches to one experience, and that if we're not feeling grief over what we've lost, then we're not getting it. And it took me a long time to kind of sit with that and figure out what to do, right? So you have this reality of understanding that there is a white system, and we didn't design it, but we live in it and benefit from it. And what do we do about that? I had a lot of grief, and it took me a long time to wrestle with how do I respond. And so what I'm learning is that we in the white dominant culture are encapsulated in bubble wrap. We have the bubble wrap of privilege. And the mainline Protestant church needs to face this, because I could argue that that's what's killing us, is that we are wrapped in this bubble wrap, never experiencing the suffering of those who don't have the privilege. And we don't want to be out of our comfort zone. We are unwilling to be out of our comfort zone. Brene Brown says that as a culture, we will do anything not to feel grief. And once we start to peel away that bubble wrap, and we start to experience the suffering of others, it's hard. And so I've started to speak out, and let me tell you, I get it wrong all the time. That Jeremiah Wright example I just used a few weeks ago in another church, I mistakenly said Otis Moss. I know both of these men. I knew who I was talking about. I mess up all the time. But I'm learning that I have to use my influence to try to help us have a conversation that helps us to understand that God's people are suffering. And they're suffering because they're left out. You know, we see these blue tarps all over town, and we kind of just want them to go away. Now, some of us are involved enough in those issues that we actually really want people to have housing, and we want them to have mental health services, and we want them to feel safe and have community. But most people just want them to go away because we can't bear to take the blue tarp up to witness the suffering that's happening under every one of those blue tarps. So one of the things the Welcoming Faith movement taught me in a roundabout way is that we have to get real with people, and we have to get real with the systems that keep us oppressed. And I don't know when you first learned that you had privilege and what you decided to do about it, but I'm trying to figure it out as I go. What I do know is that I have to talk about it more. I have a biracial granddaughter. I have Black family members that I worry about in all kinds of ways, because their experience walking in the streets is very different from most of ours. Now, I have not always felt safe in Portland. When we used to go to Klamath Falls and to Roseburg and Pendleton and all over the state we have a Reader's Theater piece that talks about transgender issues. People would say to me, aren't you scared? Why are you going to these? Because their perception was that there were all these conservatives there with shotguns that are ready to shoot me as soon as I come into town. And I remind them, you know, the only place that I have been physically threatened in Oregon, once that the police had to intervene on, is Portland. I've never been physically threatened outside of Portland. And so I haven't always felt like I'm in the system, but I recognize that I do have some privilege that others don't have, and so I feel a responsibility as a professional lesbian and as a person of faith to speak out and to do what we can. So I'm gonna talk for just another couple of minutes, and then I want to open it up for questions and conversation. So when I was in seminary, we used to listen to, sometimes we'd get these videos from Peter Gomes. He taught at Harvard. Do you know him? Black, gay, amazing theologian. He wrote The Scandalous Gospel of Jesus, and I love one of my favorite lines in that is he says, if you're not offending someone, it's not the gospel. Well, he used to talk about what's the burden of the text. Anytime we look at the text, well, what's the burden of the text? And my version of that is, so what? Right? We read the spiritual truth, so what? What does it mean to us? So what does this knowledge around privilege and inclusion, what does that mean for us? Because what lots of liberal churches think it means is you put Black Lives Matter sign in the window and a rainbow flag on the lawn and you've done the work. Because you went to the workshop and you got the certificate and that's the work. But that's actually not where the work starts. The work starts is you got to feel the discomfort. You've got to take off the bubble wrap and be willing to feel the grief. We have to face the suffering that's happening. If we don't understand what our non-binary and gender non-conforming siblings are experiencing, we're in the bubble wrap. If we don't understand how trans people of color cannot go out on the street anywhere and feel safe, it's because we have the bubble wrap on. So we have to be willing to look and to see and to feel and to be engaged to create change. We also have to accept the urgency of the moment. I can't tell you how many times I have had a straight white guy say to me, I hear your passion. I want to deck them. Right? Because our people are dying. Why don't you have that urgency? Because you're in the bubble wrap and you're not having to face it. So we have to get more comfortable with feeling that urgency because the world is on fire. And the world needs us to be engaged. And the other thing that we're losing the ability to do, studies are showing that the challenge of screen time, of having so much screen time, is that we're losing our ability to empathize. And if we lose our ability to empathize, how are we ever going to create authentic community? And every religious tradition advocates creating authentic community. It's central to every religious tradition. And to just people of goodwill. You don't have to be religious to see the need for authentic community. We have to get better at talking to people and creating community with people that maybe don't think like we do. Or maybe we don't look at every issue. In our family, the pacifists that we are, Dallas Cowboy fans actually talk to New York Giants fans. Maybe not during the game. But I say that as a way of, realizing that we have to talk to some of the red people. And we have to talk to the people that practice a different religion or have a different view of Jesus than we do. Because we need each other.